Welcome to Private Capital Insiders, a podcast brought to you by Private Capital Global, a Spark Group company. Eastward Partners sits at the center of today's conversation, and I'm joined by two leaders who are shaping how private equity and high-growth companies think about talent, value creation, and leadership, Joe Carbone and Keri Laine. Today, we're diving into how Eastward Partners is transforming human capital into a true value creation lever for private equity firms and their portfolio companies, from first leadership hire through full-scale team builds. My first guest, Joe Carbone, is the founder and CEO of Eastward Partners, a retained executive search and human capital consulting firm that partners with some of the most sought-after private equity sponsors, financial advisory firms, and strategy houses worldwide. With more than 2 decades of experience as an executive search operator and entrepreneur, Joe has built an elite track record helping middle market sponsors and their portfolio companies pull the talent lever to drive immediate and sustainable value creation. Partnering with Joe in this work is my second guest, Keri Laine, a seasoned operating partner to CEOs, boards, private equity, and venture investors. As CEO of Keri Laine Executive Solutions, Keri has helped more than 300 C-level executives scale organizations by aligning leadership, organizational strategy, and operational excellence. Together, Joe and Keri bring a powerful combination of data-driven search, leadership analytics, and hands-on operating experience to the table. In this conversation, we're going to unpack how Eastward Partners is redefining what search partner means for private equity. So with that, let's jump in and explore how Joe, Keri, and Eastward Partners are helping sponsors and management teams turn talent strategy into a durable competitive advantage. Because smart private capital moves start with insightful conversation. Let's get to it.
Hey, Keri and Joe, it's been a while since we've last spoken or seen each other. I guess it was down in Miami, and it's chilly down there right now as it is up here in New York. So I'm not feeling
Indeed
too
it
bad, but
is.
it's great to have you both on the podcast today. So I'm wondering, private equity firms today, a large part of your practice is with private equity or private equity backed organizations. I know that's not all you do, but it's a significant part of your practice. Are you seeing that they're increasingly focused on operational excellence and value creation like all the others? And how is that changing the types of relationships that they're expecting to have with their executive search firms today?
Well, Frank, thanks for having me. And I would agree 100%. It's about 35 degrees down in Southeast Florida. So when I get off this podcast, I'll put on my hoodie back on. But I appreciate the opportunity. And thanks for the question, actually. So the answer is yes. You know, for private equity firms are certainly focused on operational excellence and value creation. I don't think you can look anywhere inside of private equity and not see something that significantly points to a value creation plan. And when it comes to search firms, I kind of carve out 3 lanes in which private equity is looking for in their search firm. And I think the first is being less transactional, right? So how do you become a thought partner with your private equity client, right? So how do you uh, build that credibility to be embedded across a portfolio, to help think about benches and tracking performance and advising on succession planning. I think it's really important to be able to kind of not just open and close a deal, but to stay with that deal through, you know, the first 100 days into kind of the hold period, right? And really calibrating that leadership as you go. It builds trust. It shows your pattern recognition, things of that nature. Second thing I would say is, you know, private equity wants to know that you know your stuff, right? So operator fluency is really important. Understanding the language of private equity, EBITDA, integration, transformation, scale, multiples, things that are going to be important. And they may seem like buzzwords, but when you're, you know, talking to executive candidates, and clients alike. It's a real important part of being able to talk their language. And so that, is important. And that carries with it, a certain ability to demonstrate a track record in the space, right? And other private equity firms you've worked with and other searches you've completed and things of that nature. And then, search is certainly moving upstream. I mean, you both could probably see the amount of search firms that have flooded into the private equity markets. We've been
Yeah.
servicing private equity for the last decade. And so it's not surprising to me that more firms are trying to get market share. But when I talk about going upstream, I really, I think about how do you get closer to your clients during diligence or at the thesis stage, right? When they're pressure testing their current leadership team against the value creation plan. So access, from my perspective, is table stakes, right? So it's not who's available, but who can actually execute the plan under specific, environmental constraints. So I would say those three things in short, and there's probably others that people will add to that, but those three things come top of
Yeah.
mind.
Any thoughts to add to that, Keri?
Yeah, I think about why. We're seeing this more and more. And when I sit back and ask why now, Joe, you said you've been working with private equity for nearly a decade now. There has been a substantial increase in the focus on this value creation through talent, especially executive level leadership in the last couple of years. And if you look at the economic factors around why that has to be, there are ways that PE has to look differently at their portcos, which is forcing them to look at their talent and leadership differently. To Joe's point, also succession planning, for example, might not have been something a search firm would have had to identify or be consultative about before, but now that's helping them stay a true partner with the PE firm by helping them identify problems or gaps in the future that could be solved sooner than when it actually becomes a problem, right? So if we weren't as an industry in private equity looking at talent this closely, what happens when you examine things more closely is more opportunity comes up and the conversation gets greater. And I think that's why it's happening now. And I think that's the opportunity that Joe and Eastward Partners has the chance to be able to really cultivate solutions for, which makes a really big difference when you look at the rate of returns and the speed of returns that they wouldn't get without firms like Joe.
Historically, we hear that the private equity firms are looking for people with private equity experience. That seems to be pivoting where they want that operational experience now. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. Look, everything is situational, right? But a private equity firm, uh, a handful of years ago, when there were tailwinds in the financial engineering time period, they thought they could plug in an operator who had private equity experience, has been there, done that playbook, and you lock them into that role, and you can see the ROI on that investment. Where today it's very different because of all of the headwinds, right? Private equity have been dealing with headwinds for several years. And although things seem to be getting better, not easier, those headwinds still exist. And so getting the right executives to perform under stress is first and foremost key in any executive hire, right? How do you test for that is a different conversation we can have. So I would agree, Frank. If I put two executives together and one executive had private equity experience through, the tailwinds of, the financial engineering era versus, the last 4 or 5 years, and really could show the scar tissue and the battle scars from, turning around a portfolio company or carving out a company out of an asset and standing up a new function, whatever the case may be. I think that person will have a better chance at being successful in the role.
Yeah. And Keri, I'm sure that's something you see a lot in your area of the practice.
Yeah, I think leadership in general is changing dynamics, which is being forced from a lot of external factors. So the leader of, 5 years ago is not the same leader of today. So you can have a certain check the box resume, you can have a check the box experience journey. But what it comes down to is what are the competencies that show certain tenacity and fortitude, relational capability, conflict management capabilities, and those things were not necessarily looked at before. You could plug somebody in with a set of responsibilities and expect that they could execute. Now you have to have a very dynamic person with leadership traits that are not the same as before. So to take somebody that has those that largely cannot be taught and teach them more about the environment of the company and the function, that's a much harder, more specific hire. And I think that's where the attention of this is going, and where the expertise that partners like Eastward bring
Yeah.
really help benefit the firms.
And that kind of takes my thinking into the people risk versus deal risk loop. So private equity firms are applying and have applied enormous amounts of rigor to underwriting deals, but often far less rigor to underwriting people. So why does that gap still exist? Does it still exist? And where does it most often show up?
Go ahead, Keri.
This
I have
this
an answer, but I know you'll have a great one.
It definitely does still exist. And I think that's why Joe and I are really excited to be on here talking to you, because it's something that needs to be talked about a lot more. You're seeing a curve where it's changing, but the diligence related to people, it exists today for a couple of reasons. One, they budget for it. They say 7 out of 10 deals fail. 70 to 90% of those failure rates are directly related to talent and leadership issues. They either know that and have planned for that and are okay with that. It's one culture, one option. The other is they don't want to deal with it because it seems intangible, and that's the human aspect of it. Where you have firms like mine and Joe's that are able to make the intangible aspects of a deal tangible, which means we know how to use assessments, we know how to use frameworks and processes to validate future predictable success of talent. That is something that you can leverage to be able to flip those statistics. And so if they don't want to deal with the human aspect of it, that's what we can help them do. On the third aspect of it, it's not something that has presented itself yet, based on whatever the investment thesis has been, but it surely will. It surely will. So those are the things that I've seen is to why it's a gap, and why it's closing, and what people
Yeah.
need to do to be able to close it.
You're definitely helping with risk mitigation right there, which resonates with the financial folks, right? So,
Well, Frank, I've talked about underwriting a search process before it begins. I think I've kind of created that tagline over the handful of years, 5 or 6 years, and I've really ran with it. And to Keri's point, leadership performance is contextual, right? And it's often masked by favorable tailwinds and prior roles, which we talked about in your prior question. I think the highest failure rates really occur post close, whether during integration or carve outs, or in the first quarter when the quarterly results are missed. And typically, and Keri, correct me if I'm wrong, we see that when leadership is under stress. Right. So when you talk about, the operational rigor of a private equity executive versus one that may have been around when they had some tailwinds, you see that in this environment. So that's kind of my anecdote, Keri. I don't know if you would agree, but yeah.
yeah, Joe, you have definitely, coined that term in my mind. I read that term in your LinkedIn posts a lot, and I think it really resonates well. And you've also described your technology platform, Echo, as enabling directional diligence, which might be an oxymoron for private equity, but rather than traditional diligence. So, what does that mean in practice? Like, how does that change decision making across the deal life cycle?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Look, I will admit, right, you'll never have perfect information about people. Right. So I think first and foremost, that's just a hard truth. Right. You can gather as much information as you want on a subset of people. Their behaviors are going to change and are indicative of their environment. And when that environment changes, as does their behavior and outcomes. And so traditional diligence tries to answer the question, is this person good or bad? Right. Where directional diligence really answers more of a useful question. Right. Which is, given this thesis, the timeline, the constraints that we see in this deal, is this leader more likely to create value or become friction? And so, Echo doesn't attempt to kind of render a binary judgment. It establishes directionally across a set of human capital signals. And so we look at operating context, mobility, network, gravity, right? So, team followership, team building behavior, situational fit, things of that nature. And our sponsors can get that information up front and then make decisions eyes wide open.
Great.
I
Makes
think too, it
sense.
adds to the conversation when you're bringing on an executive. To Joe's point, you're not going to have a perfect person, just like you're not going to have perfect set of information. So when the conversation starts early and Joe and Eastward are able to provide that insight, you get to understand the gaps and start planning for the gaps or development of those gaps going into it eyes wide open, which is where Eastward and KLES partner quite a bit is when they're in, how do you make them the most successful contribution to the team and to the organization once they're there? And those things become known so that you de-risk that ultimate decision in the end.
Yeah. And Joe, you mentioned the post-hire value creation. Like most firms are treating the hiring as a pass fail. It's black and white. You hire someone, you're done. But you both talk about the hire as the beginning of value creation. How do you both think about the right balance between the technology, the data, the human expertise in executive search and leadership decisions?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, everything in life, Frank, is a balance. And so I think, the data, from my standpoint, informs the underwriting before the hire, right? While the human judgment contextualizes it, right? So I think, post hire, both continue to, operate tracking execution and recalibrating expectations, and then intervening earlier rather than reacting later. So, human expertise is indispensable for that. And data can tell you what's happened and what is directionally likely to happen, but it can't tell you why. It can't tell you what under what pressure or how that leader behaves when the plan breaks, right? So, Keri, I don't know your thoughts, but that's kind of how I see it.
No, I totally agree. And I would add to that two key things that it does is it reduces thrash, that subjective opinions or people's personality judgments can be made without validation. That when you use subsets of data or assessment or tools such as Echo, you are able to reduce that thrash, which generates the ability to create a faster decision with greater trust. So you're essentially using all of that information in order to validate the decision, which then it's really speed of trust.
Yeah. Does it make sense to come up with an example? I'm not sure you can decline to respond to this question, but is there an example of something where you know what they did actually, 1 to 6 months after bringing somebody in, I'm sure there's a follow-on support function you provide, right? Post placement. So
Well,
is there
I,
an
I have
example?
a I have a really interesting example. If we're staying in pre-search diligence, where really the tool of Echo becomes most effective, um, we were going through a case study with a client, and we were reviewing one of their current portfolio companies, and I won't say who the client is or nor the portfolio company. But in our analysis, we saw that the sitting head of sales, the VP of sales for this company, was underperforming relative to his peer group. And it's a simple 2 by 2, and there's some data science math that goes into that. But basically, the net was the client pointed out, oh, our head of sales is underperforming relative to their peer groups in this company. And we said, yes, they are. Here are the performance metrics that we provided. And then they continued to share that they actually exited that executive from the portfolio company. So it just validates the fact that there are ways to underwrite a search, but also to underwrite performance and look at some key indicators of how an executive is performing in that role relative to their peers within the same sector, same size company, and same time frame. So that's just an anecdote, an example that comes to mind that, and typically I share because it's so poignant.
Yeah. So you're advocating using data versus these gut decisions, and obviously being able to show, you know, specifics about the metrics around this particular role has got to be hugely helpful. Keri, did you have something that you wanted to jump in on there?
Well, I'm sort of smiling because KLES is essentially in existence because most of these conversations don't happen until the wheels fall off 6 months later. And so what we try to do when we work with Eastward is how do we get ahead of that curve? How do we help them help themselves in a way where they don't reach that point? And so instead of a firm like ours being called in after the fact, once they realize that the quarterly numbers aren't being met or it's not a great fit, and then going to Joe, how do we do this with them at the forefront, which saves a lot of time, headache, but also again, it's back to how fast are you able to perform in the portfolio?
Yeah, and I'll add to that, because I'm such a huge advocate for what Keri and her firm does, and we've partnered with them for years. Um, creating a roadmap so that you have visibility into the development points, into the pros of an executive, into some gaps of development in areas where the private equity firm could really help step in, and whether it's an executive coach or what have you, I think it's invaluable, right? So not just underwriting it from a data perspective when looking at performance metrics of executives, but how, based on Keri's work, can the private equity firm and or the company get that executive to where they need to be, right? Because you're just never going to find there's no such thing as a perfect fit. There's always going to be something that you need to pay attention to.
Yeah. We all have to decide like where's the 20% we'll be flexible with. If you've got 75 to 80% of all your check boxes checked, things look good. I think you need to ask the client to make a decision based on that. And agreeing on that up front is probably the best way to avoid conflict and arrive to a decision instead of vacillating and going back and forth and then losing an opportunity on a candidate altogether because they're gone or maybe they're not as interested. So that's really interesting.
The other thing
I
I'll
bet.
say, Frank, just you just kind of brought up a thought, which we didn't cover, and this, Keri, you'll have something to say about this. Alignment is probably the most important aspect of any executive search or leadership training and development program that you're going to implement. And when you think specifically about private equity, you've got the investor who has a say. You have the operating team, right? CEO who has a say, and the board. And then you throw in the executive search consultant who, if they've been around as long as Eastward and longer, have dealt with hundreds, if not thousands of executives and have a real perspective on what good looks like and what a good process looks like and things of that nature. So, for me, the alignment is key. And Keri, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. When you think about that vacillation, right, and that friction, getting all parties at least directionally to agree to what a mandate looks like, what a leadership plan looks like is really key.
And I think that setting the expectations on both sides is part of that success factor because if you're an executive coming into a firm, but there's no real communication or dialogue around this, around what does it mean to be a positive contributing producing fit, then it's left up to interpretation. And that's where I see when we come in and do our board relations work, we're trying to figure out how do we bridge a relational gap between either the C-suite, the CEO, or the board after the fact. And the friction there is because those expectations or conversations were not set. And so how do you develop that relationship, to Joe's point on the alignment piece, that brings those closer together? And that has a direct impact on productivity as well as retention for the rest of the executive team, output of the rest of the executive team, and never mind all the culture and engagement for the rest of the company. It's a really big
Yeah.
deal.
Yeah. The data, having a technology, big differentiator. There's the culture factor too. I think private equity is more open to acknowledging that culture plays a big role. Keri, do you have anything to add to that? Or
Yeah, I
any?
think it comes full circle back to the questions that we started with. The reason why I think they're paying attention to it is because there's more and more people focusing on how do you validate the data around culture. It's not just a soft buzzword anymore. Doesn't mean sitting around the campfire singing kumbaya, right? With certain assessments and certain products and programs like Echo that are being built that are new that were never there years ago. It was just a fluff term, a feel good term. And now there's data and metrics and KPIs and ways to prove
Right.
out that the cultural impact has a direct impact on the bottom line.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, this is great. If we're kind of coming to the end of our time, unfortunately, we could probably talk for another half an hour on this. It's really interesting stuff. But what would you want someone listening to this podcast to take away from this? I, our audience is probably far and wide, anywhere from investors, GPs. How they're all going to be here, but I think there's at least two or three interesting takeaways that I could think of. Can you share a couple things that we could leave folks with, our golden nuggets?
I mean, I would say the right executive search partner is your friend, right? And if you're able to leverage them appropriately and partner with them early on in any phase of the deal of a life cycle, you're going to get the best out of them, right? So the alignment will be there, the trust will be there, understanding the portfolio and the players inside of the portfolio are certainly a big part of how an executive search firm can be beneficial, and really just having a cadence of sharing information. I think that a lot of new entrants into the marketplace see the private equity arena as a place where they can come and, work on some sexy mandates and throw up some great logos. But, this is serious business. And I think you need to select a search firm that understands how serious it is to get the right leader in place, and a firm that is authentic to themselves, right? And not trying to play a different part in the greater kind of operation, but is coming as they are and meeting you where you are. And so I know that's kind of fluff, right, to use Keri's word, but the right search firm will unlock value across your portfolio, and it might take some reps, right, for them to truly understand the ecosystem that you're operating in, but ultimately that time will be well spent for sure.
Great. And Keri?
I think when I think so much of our world is moving so fast and things are changing so much more rapidly than anybody could ever anticipate. The one thing that I keep going back to is when we're looking at return on investment, what I would ask people to do is consider what the ROR is, which is the return on relationships. And take that for however you will, whether it's relationships with firms like Eastward, relationships with your own team, relationships when you're trying to hire somebody, the relationship element is significant for a deal, for an organization, for the success of a company. And there are formulaic ways to be able to calculate that now. And so, aside from looking at just your basic financials, look at the ROR of what you do, and where you find deficit there. That's where some real important work could be done.
Yeah. I'd also like to add that in the trends that we see today, especially in the middle market, where PE firms are bringing in their own talent leaders and building their own talent functions like the larger firms have. I think we'll see more of that, but it's important to not lose sight of the fact that having those strategic relationships with established executive search firms that bring a specific type of expertise is still invaluable. You may use fewer, and there's some rationale around trying to cut costs, but the opportunity cost could far outweigh these other factors. So I think that relationship comment is especially important, even when it comes to building that relationship, not only with the leadership team, the GPs, the deal team, all those other folks, but the human capital team as well, and
Yeah,
really be an extension of their capabilities. I think that plays right into what you're both saying.
yeah, absolutely.
Well, Joe and Keri, this has really gone by super quickly. We could be talking here for another 30 minutes or an hour even. Great overview of what you're both doing with the firm, with Eastward, Eastward, the leadership development, Echo, a lot of interesting things. Clearly, you guys are, you're in this and have been doing it for a while. This is not anything new to you, and I think people can hear it in the way you approach these engagements. So I hope everybody who has a need takes the opportunity to talk to you about some of the challenges they've got. And thanks for giving me your time today and sharing your knowledge on the podcast. I hope to have you back as guests in the future.
Thank you,
Frank. Appreciate the
Okay.
opportunity. Take care.
All right,
Well, that's a wrap on today's episode with Joe Carbone and Keri Laine, and a deep look into how Eastward Partners is using data, analytics, and hands-on leadership expertise to change the way private equity thinks about talent and value creation. If this conversation sparked ideas on your own portfolio, leadership team, or talent strategy, connect with Joe and the Eastward Partners team and with Keri through Keri Laine Executive Solutions to continue the dialogue. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. You can also follow Private Capital Global for more updates and exclusive content through our website, privatecapitalglobal.com. And remember, smart private capital moves start with insightful conversation. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Private Capital Insiders.